regret, this very common emotion, our most common negative emotion, something that we tend not to want to talk about, actually is giving us direction into what makes life worth living.
Really looking forward to our conversation. Enjoyed the new book. And to start off talking about regret, the thesis of the new book, I'm curious, how did you first get intrigued by that subject?
You know, I realized that a couple years ago that I had regrets of my own, and the catalyzing event was a graduation of my from college of my elder daughter, which is one of those moments, kind of mile marker moments in your life, and you think like, how did this even happen? And I started thinking about my own regrets, and what's interesting is that when I came back, Jesse, to talk about, I started thinking about them, and when I happened to mention them to a few people really leaned in. You know, I was kind of skittish about talking about some of my regrets about my own college experience, things like not being kind enough or not taking enough risks. And I found when I very skittishly revealed them to other people, instead of like people saying, ah, they were actually really interested and wanted to share their own. And that's always a very good sign for a writer.
And you talk about in the book how that's also part of the process of moving beyond the regret. So let's start off. I mean, the thesis, again, coming back to regret, it's not just regret. It's the fact that we can use regret as an emotion to do good in our life. So as somebody who's sitting here thinking about, maybe a regret or two from their past, and they're like, this keeps me up at night. This is something that I think about multiple times a day. How can this be something that is actually good for me? Let's start there.
Sure. It's a great question. And you're exactly right. It's not necessarily inherently good for you, these regrets. But it's important to know a few things. Number one is that everybody has regrets. The fact that you have a regret makes you a human being. If you didn't have regrets, that would be the sign of a big problem because our cognitive machinery is programmed for regret. But the other thing is, the most important thing is, what do you do with your regrets? And this is something that I think we haven't been taught well enough to do. When we deal with negative emotions, there's a tendency sometimes for people to say, I'm just going to ignore it. Okay, I'm going to ignore my emotions. That's like this whole ridiculous no regrets philosophy. But we also can run the other way, which is that we can wallow in our regrets. We can ruminate our regrets. We can obsess over them. And that's bad too. What we want to do is we want to use our regrets as signals for thinking, not to ignore our regrets and not to wallow in them, but to say, this regret is telling me something. It's telling me something about the world. And am I going to be receptive to receive that signal and do something about it in the future?
All right. Well, we'll take some time in the future of this conversation to get into the specifics of how we can, handle regrets in a positive way. But before we get practical, let's talk about what some of the most common regrets people are having these days are, because you're somebody who has not only written a book on this, you've had your hands dirty doing the research.
Yeah.
So let's talk about these days. What are the most common things from your research you're finding people are regretting?
Yeah. So what I did is I went out and I collected 16,000 regrets from people in 105 countries. It's a pretty massive trove of things, trove of regrets. And what I found is that all over the world, over and over again, people kept expressing the same 4 regrets. And these 4 regrets, it didn't so much matter like the domain of life. A lot of times when we think about our regrets, I have an education regret, or I have a career regret, or I have a romance regret. But what I found is that running underneath those domains was something bigger going on. And there were 4 core regrets over and over and over again around the world that people kept expressing. And I think what's interesting about these regrets is that they tell us something about life. They tell us something about the good life. That is, if we understand what people regret the most, we actually understand what they value the most. So in a weird way, it's kind of counterintuitive that this negative emotion actually gives us a path to a life well lived.
Well, you mentioned there being 4 core themes that make the foundation of regret. Let's take some time and dig into each of these, just so people can have a better understanding of different areas later when we get to what that work is, to use these in a positive way and their life to grow. Let's give them the foundation so they can figure out where the regrets are by talking about those.
Sure thing. Let's start with that. Let's start with the foundation regrets. So one category are what I call foundation regrets. Those are regrets. They encompass things like, if only I hadn't smoked. If only I'd exercised more. If only I had worked harder in school. Essentially, they say, if only I'd done the work, if only I had actually been a little bit more diligent, a little bit more conscientious, and planned a little bit more for the future. And so those are foundation regrets. And and the reason we have them is again, they reveal our need for stability. All of these regrets reveal some fundamental human needs, and the foundation regrets reveal a human need for stability. We want to have a stable platform for our lives. Second one are what I call the second one is what I call boldness regrets. Boldness regrets are like a lot of these regrets. You're at a juncture. You can play it safe or you can take the chance. And over again, when we play it safe, we often regret it. Even when we take a chance and it doesn't work out, we're less likely to regret that than we are not taking a chance at all. And with this, this is in every domain of life. It is not asking somebody out on a date. I got hundreds of regrets in this database of people who regret not asking somebody out on a date 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Regrets about not traveling and not taking enough adventures. Regrets about not starting a business. And I think what these boldness regrets show us is that we have a fundamental need for growth, for learning, for leading a psychologically rich life. So that's boldness regrets. The third category are moral regrets. It's a small category, but a very interesting one. Again, we're at a juncture. You can do the right thing or do the wrong thing. And when people do the wrong thing, not everybody, but a lot of us, a heck of a lot of us, when we do the wrong thing, we regret it. So I got hundreds of regrets about people feeling regretful about bullying kids in school, huge numbers of regrets about marital infidelity and cheating and swindling and so forth. And so these moral regrets to me reflect our fundamental need to be good, to just be decent human beings. And I think there's something kind of heartening about these moral regrets. That the fact that people are troubled by these things decades later, it suggests that most of us actually want to be good and that we value being good. And then the final one are connection regrets. Those are regrets largely about relationships, but relationships of all kind, not just simply romantic love, but friendship, affiliation, and love in a broader sense. And what typically happens here is that you have a relationship, and I hear this story over and over again in the regrets that I collected and in the interviews that I've done. You have a relationship that should be intact, that was intact or should have been intact, and it comes apart. And the way these relationships come apart typically is not dramatic. They drift apart rather than explode. And so, and once again, we're at a juncture. So you can say you're at a juncture. I could reach out or not reach out. And when people don't reach out, they really, really deeply regret it. So again, and this shows, I think, our fundamental need for belonging, for affiliation, and for love. And so we put all these things together, and they actually show what do we want out of life? I mean, seriously, what do we want out of life? We want some stability. We want a chance to do something in our limited time here. We want to be good, and we want to have some love and connection. And everything else is commentary.
So the idea behind this and sharing all we just shared is it for people to grasp that and use that information moving forward, areas that they should be, investing more energy, investing more time. The area I'm curious about is how do we make amends with the stuff we've done in the past?
Great point. Yeah. So let's take an example. So let me take one step back. In the architecture of regret, one of the most important distinctions are regrets of action and regrets of inaction. Regretting what you did and regretting what you didn't do. Now, for action regrets, we have some options. So let's say that you bullied somebody. What I have stories of are people who bullied somebody years ago and then actually go back and apologize. Maybe not make perfect amends, but try to make some kind of amends, atone in some way for that. If you cheat somebody, you can make them whole again. So, or if you have, like, for instance, I have somebody people who get tattoos and regret getting tattoos. You can have your tattoo removed, all right? So you can undo that regret. So that's one thing. Another thing you can do with action regrets is that you can find the silver lining in them and perform what's called a downward counterfactual what I like to call an at least. So you can say, and I have hundreds of these in the database too, for instance, in things like this, almost all from women, saying, oh, I really regret marrying that idiot, but at least I have these 2 great kids. So find the silver lining in those. So for action regrets, you have those 2 kinds of remedies. They're imperfect, but they can be useful. For inaction regrets, it's a little harder, but there's a mechanism for dealing with those as well.
So let's stick on the action here for a little bit and talk about, you gave that example of, bullying somebody and then maybe going back years later, finding them, apologizing, and then getting, being able to move forward because of that apology. But what about in the case where somebody, that person has passed away or they're unable to locate that person?
That's a hard one that you can't do anything about. So, for instance, there are plenty of. It's amazing to me, Jesse, how often I hear this story where people want to reach out to somebody, never get around to it, and then the person passes away. So that is and it's not like that's what amazed me in compiling all this is that's not like a one-off. Like that's happened to a lot of people. And so we can think about certain kinds of regrets as open door regrets and closed door regrets. With that closed door regret, okay? So I have a story in the book about a woman who was close childhood friends with another woman, and then the second woman became seriously ill, and the first woman wanted to reach out and wanted to call her and put it off and felt awkward and didn't do it. And by the time she got a chance to do it, that person had passed away. You can't do anything about that. That's a closed door. All you can do on that one is feel that terrible feeling, that stab of negativity, and not wallow in it, but say, whoa, that stab of negativity is telling me something, and try to extract a lesson from that. And the woman whom I'm talking about actually used that lesson and applied it later in her life, and now is much more likely to reach out because of that terrible experience. So sometimes the door is open, sometimes the door is closed. With closed doors, can't do anything about it. You can only plan for the future. With open doors, you have a chance to repair.
I like that idea. So we're using that experience as a catalyst in the future. So likely, having an experience like that where somebody has passed and there's nothing you can do, you're going to be more likely to make amends while somebody is still around and to invest in that relationship.
Yes, exactly.
So the other thing you talk about in the book, Dan, is using an idea of a regret for the future in the present to make better choices down the line.
Yeah.
So let's talk about working the other way around and having a regret and a thought about what that might do down the line and how that can change things moving forward.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we can do is we can anticipate our regrets, and but that's tricky, and we have to do it the right way. Sometimes when we anticipate regrets, we end up making very risk-averse decisions. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say you're taking a multiple choice test. When I was taking multiple choice tests, the advice was always, don't switch your answer. All right, always go with your first instinct. If you think it's B, and then you later on think it's C, don't switch to C. Got to go with B, and that ends up being incredibly wrong-headed advice. There's empirical evidence showing that we're actually more likely to get it right when we switch. But the reason we don't do that is that we anticipate greater regret from switching from a right answer to a wrong answer than we do with sticking with a wrong answer. And as a consequence, we actually don't make the right move. So sometimes when we anticipate our regrets, we become too timid. So the key here is when we anticipate our regrets is to do the following, is to, if you're at a decision point, go forward in time, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, look back on that decision and say, am I going to, which of these choices am I going to regret? Now, what's important here is that you limit this to the core regrets. You have to ask yourself, is this going to build my foundation? Is this going to help me take a sensible risk? Is this going to help me do the right thing? is this going to help me build connections to other people? And if the answer, and that becomes a really important way to make those decisions going forward in time and looking retrospectively. What you don't want to do is try to maximize every single choice in your life and avoid regret. You don't want to look back. You don't want to go forward 5 years and say, oh, what am I going to regret more, buying a blue car or a green car? It doesn't matter. What am I going to regret more, having macaroni and cheese for dinner or turkey tetrazzini? It doesn't matter. Okay. So these regrets, this whole body of regrets tell us is that there's a small circle of things that deeply matter to us down the road. The small circle of things for which we have deep and lasting regrets. And those are the regrets to avoid. Other times, just make a decision and move on. And this is actually a really, really important piece of guidance, I think, generally. There's some long-lasting research in social psychology talking about what are called maximizers and satisficers. Maximizers try to maximize every single decision, get the best of every single decision. What pencil am I going to use? Let me get the very best pencil. What, water glass am I going to use? Let me get the very best water glass, and then some of us are satisfiers. All right, this pencil's good enough. This water glass is good enough. And what the research tells us is that maximizers are miserable. They're just miserable because it's impossible to maximize everything. And so what we want to do is we want to maximize the things that really matter. And we know what really matters. These 4 things really matter. Everything else, just satisfy on. Make a choice and move on.
And Dan, when you're comparing and doing this research and looking at, different backgrounds, different sexes, different, levels of finance and people from all over the world, do you find that typically as human beings, it all comes back to these 4 core regrets?
Mostly, yes. Yeah. I think a lot of times when you look at what people regret, it seems to come back over and over again to these 4 things. That's not true for every single person in every single circumstance. But, I have regrets from 105 countries, and there's very, very little national variation there. Now, I also did another piece of research where I did a quantitative survey, a massive public opinion poll of the US population, looking at Americans' attitudes toward regret. And I was able to put together a sample that was representative, which allowed me to try to find differences in an American sample based on gender, based on education level, based on race. And the differences aren't massive, but there are a few. So for instance, let's take age. At age 20, people tend to have about the same number of action and inaction regrets. But as people age, inaction regrets take over. So the older you are, the more likely you are to have an inaction regret. You also have a sort of an interesting phenomenon where people, I found this kind of surprising, but I finally made sense of it, that people with higher levels of education have more career regrets than people with lower levels of formal education. And at first that seems kind of weird, but what it shows is that when you have high levels of education, you actually have more opportunities and therefore more foregone opportunities based on your choice. There's some modest differences based on race. That is, in the U.S., African Americans have more education-related regrets than white Americans, and I think that has to do with fewer educational opportunities, often on average, for African Americans versus white Americans. And so a lot of these things come back to this notion of opportunity. That is, sometimes we have regrets when we have lots of opportunities. Sometimes we have regrets when we have thwarted opportunities. But that tells us something really important here, is that if you look at these 4 regrets, they're all about either opportunity or obligation. So boldness regrets are all about opportunity. Moral regrets are all about obligation. Foundation regrets are sort of a mix of both, and connection regrets are sort of a mix of both. And when we look at this also, again, the thing is, this led me to a place that I didn't expect to go. that these, like, I was just trying to figure out what regret was and how it worked. And to my surprise, it started revealing what I think are these pretty fundamental truths about what makes life worth living. Because again, these regrets come back to opportunity and obligation. And when we think about those things together, imagine you have a life that's all opportunity and no obligation. It sounds fun, but it's kind of hollow, right? Imagine then if you have a life of all obligation and no opportunity. It's kind of severe. And I think that a good life is a life that fuses opportunity and obligation, where you have opportunities and you fulfill your obligations. I think that is a good and true life. And once again, regret, this very common emotion, our most common negative emotion, something that we tend not to want to talk about, actually is giving us direction into what makes life worth living.
We talked earlier about active regrets and how we could maybe remedy that. Let's talk about inactive on the other end of the spectrum, and say it's somebody that, had opportunity to go to college and thought about chasing this degree and this career.
Yeah.
And now they're, 65 years old, they're at retirement age, and they realize that they were just working for a paycheck and they never got a lot of satisfaction from that. At that age, how do they go about reconciling that and
Yeah.
making amends with their previous decisions?
So that's difficult. And I mean, a lot of people with precisely that story. But there's some things that you can do. So one thing you can do for inaction regrets is that you can reframe the regret. So we tend to, when we have mistakes or blunders or errors of inaction or anything like that, there are two ways we can sort of react. We can kind of boost our self-esteem and say, oh, you're awesome anyway. Or we can just launch into self-criticism. And what the research tells us is that there's a third way, which is something called self-compassion, which is to look at those decisions in the way that you would look at them for somebody else. So think about that 65-year-old person. He or she might be saying, oh, you idiot, you ruined it. You wasted your shot. What are you doing? Like, we talk to ourselves that way, but we were never talked to another human being that way. So the first step is actually reframing the regret, treating yourself with some kindness. This is the research on self-compassion started by Kristen Neff at the University of Texas about 20 years ago. Very, very powerful stuff. The treating yourself with some degree of self-compassion, recognizing that you're not the only one with this kind of regret. Believe me, I can go into my database and find you 75 more in 13 seconds that are exactly like this. And recognizing that this is part of the shared human experience. Second thing that you can do is you can disclose it. And this is actually really powerful. One of the things we see about regret is that when we reveal it to other people, when we simply disclose it to ourselves even, it relieves the burden. And one of the reasons it relieves the burden is that these negative emotions are often very kind of cloudy and abstract and blobby. And by talking about them or even writing about them, we convert these abstractions into concrete words, and that makes them less fearsome and begins the sense-making process. The other thing about disclosure to other people is that there's a pile of research showing that when we disclose vulnerabilities about ourselves, people don't like us less, they like us more. And so that skittishness we have about revealing is often misplaced. And finally, the key thing here for that 65-year-old is to extract a lesson from it, okay? Extract a lesson from it. So what did I learn from that? This regret is part of the human condition. I'm telling people about it. I'm making sense of it. Now, what's the lesson I'm going to derive from that? The lesson I'm going to derive from that is, hey, I'm 65 and maybe I have a couple of decades left. I better take a chance. So the next time I'm at this juncture, I'm going to take a chance. I'm not going to wallow in this negative feeling. I'm going to use it as a catalyst for changing my behavior. What's more, especially for people who are a little bit older, that gives them a huge amount of meaning, is I'm going to take my regret, extract a lesson from it, and transmit that to younger people and say, I made a wrong choice. I want to teach you from my mistakes. And so again, that 65-year-old, the way to think about it, extract that lesson, and the lesson is very clear. Take the chance. The next time you're in a situation where you can take the chance, you know what to do.
You talked about disclosing there, and that seems like it'd be really difficult for a lot of people, especially if they're disclosing to family or friends and
Yeah.
people that they haven't had that kind of interaction with in the past. What I'm curious about, this ties back to your research. When people were, sharing their regrets with you, doing the research, how challenging was that for people?
It's such an interesting question. And the answer is not very challenging at all. I mean, we it's amazing there's some interesting research showing how much satisfaction people get out of disclosure, especially for negative things, because it's an unburdening. I'll give you an example. So in this World Regrets Survey, this collection of 16,000 regrets, I invited people to submit their regrets. So the things that people revealed were just amazing. I mean, some of it was like an online confessional. But I also gave people the chance to submit their email address if they wanted to be contacted for follow-up interviews. I expected maybe 5 or 6% of people would do that. We had like 30% but 1 out of 3 people said, here's my regret. Hey, I cheated on my spouse, and here's my email address if you ever want to talk to me about it. I mean, it's amazing. Even if you look at I appreciate you reading the book. If you look at the book, I originally planned because people were talking about some sensitive things. I gave people the option, okay, I can use a pseudonym, I can use only your first name, and there were 2 people who didn't want me to use their name. In one case, I used a pseudonym. In one case, I only used a first name. But everybody else was perfectly fine on my using their names because, again, our instincts about disclosure are wrong. Like, we want to disclose. And the truth is that, as I mentioned before, when we disclose, in most cases, not everyone, people don't think less of us. They actually empathize with us and they admire our courage for being vulnerable. It's a big lesson. Now, that said, the research also says that a way to process some of these negative experiences, even if you're someone like me who's skittish about disclosing these things in public, disclosing it to others, that simply writing about it privately is actually really useful because it aids in the unburdening process. And again, converting the blobby emotions into concrete words aids in the sense-making process.
Well, talking about this disclosing thing, whether it be through journaling or talking with other people, sounds a lot like therapy. And probably the benefits people get from this is a lot like what they get from talking to another person, a therapist.
I think so. I mean, I'm obviously not a therapist, but some of the ways that we reckon with our regret, reframe them as part of the human experience, disclose them in a way to make sense of them, extract a lesson from them. That process is actually somewhat consistent with things like cognitive behavior therapy. It really is. That was not my aim, but again, the research points us to that way of dealing with them. And again, we have choices here. We can take these negative emotions and just throw them away, pretend emotions aren't real and not care about them. That's a bad idea. But it's also a bad idea to say, oh my gosh, these negative emotions are the only truth in the world. They define me fully. I'm going to, bathe in the negativity. That's a bad idea too. What we want to do is we want to use negative emotions for thinking. And there's a famous line from basically the founder of modern psychology, a guy named William James, who implied or said, sort of said, why do we think? And he says, thinking is for doing, right? That's why. Why do human beings think? We think in order to do. But then the question is, what are feelings for? And in my view, feeling is for thinking. Feeling is for thinking. Thinking is for doing. Feeling is not for ignoring, and feeling is not for wallowing. Feeling is for thinking. And when we think about when we look at the research on our emotions, since 40 years ago, this research started. Regret is one of the most common emotions we experience. It is typically the most common negative experience negative emotion we experience. And so ignoring it is a bad idea. Wallowing is a bad idea. Using it as a signal for our thoughts is a good idea.
You bring up that wallowing point. It's important we go that other way and talk about somebody who does take this too far. Maybe there's somebody that hasn't really, looked at a lot of their regrets and they've kind of walled them off up until this point, but then they decide to get in there and start looking at them, and maybe that causes them to start overthinking and ruminating, getting caught up in these negative thought loops and emotions. So how do we stop, going down that slope?
I mean, it's such a great point. It's really, I mean, that's actually really, really important. The way to do that is to deal with the regrets systematically, as I was talking about before. Reframe them as part of the human experience, treating yourself with kindness rather than contempt, disclosing them either to others to lift the burden or to yourself as a way to make sense of them, and 3, extracting a lesson from it. Right? If you don't take that final step and say, okay, what did I learn from this and what am I going to do next time? Then you can stay stuck in that cycle of rumination. But if you, again, feeling is for thinking, okay? And a lot of times we have this dichotomy where some people, I'm a feeler, I'm a thinker. And the thing is, human beings are both. That emotion and cognition go together. They are inextricably linked. And if we think about it, if we approach it systematically, feeling is for thinking, thinking is for doing, then regret can be for making us better.
Dan, you have this really unique insight on our human psyche, not as a whole, but, as a broader view than most people, having done this research and looking at all the different regrets and seeing these patterns. So coming to the end of that, writing this book, I'm curious, what would you say is the most profound thing you've learned about the human condition from looking at all these regrets?
About the human condition, that's interesting.
Just as a whole.
I think if I had to pick one thing, it would be the universality of these 4 regrets. How often they come up in North American culture, in Asian culture, in European culture, among men, among women, among the old, among the young, that it is. I mean, I don't want to sound like a Disney movie, but there is something. There's some truth, some deep truth to the idea. Is like deep down, we're not all that different. I mean, as syrupy as that sounds. And so I think that the thing that I took away from this really was the universality of these kinds of emotions, the universality of these regrets and what they reveal about what makes life worth living. For me personally, the biggest takeaway was from the connection regrets, which is the lesson to always reach out. I'm telling you, I mean, and that's something that I haven't been good at. Again, if you're at a juncture, and remember, regrets begin at a juncture. If you're at a juncture, you say, should I reach out or should I not reach out? You've answered the question. Simply being at that juncture and wondering gives you the answer. And I think that one takeaway for me is always reach out. If you're thinking about reaching out, reach out. Always reach out. You're not going to regret that.
And since completing this book, have you been a lot better at that?
I've tried. I have one New Year's resolution because I believe in fewer New Year's resolutions, and that is my New Year's resolution is to reach out to more people more often, and I'm trying to do that because I realize I haven't been good at that, and part of it is that like a lot of the people who I wrote about, we have this mistaken belief that when we reach out, it's going to feel really awkward, and the other side's not going to care. And we are almost always wrong about that. It's not nearly as awkward as we think, and the other side almost always cares, always welcomes it. And so I'm trying to get past that pluralistic ignorance on my own part and reach out.
As one of the resources in the book, I was really excited to see, and you had it at the bottom of one of the pages, the research by that nurse that was talking to people at the end of their lives and sharing their regrets with her. How does that all fit into all this?
Well, that was interesting. Bronnie Ware was a hospice nurse, and she, started asking people about their regrets, and she collected a few dozen of them. And, I think that it again, I think it's fairly, what she found in those few dozen regrets, I think is fairly consistent with what I found. What I think is interesting is that um, I don't want people to wait till the end of the final days of their life to think about their regrets, because exactly as you said before, if you don't have that much mileage ahead of you, you can't really do anything about them. And so what I want is for us to reckon with them with our brains earlier in our lives, recognize that they're part of the human experience, and use them to lead the rest of our lives in a more fruitful way.
Yeah, I think having access to that information is really powerful for a lot of us that still have a lot of years to understand, what we might get caught up in if we don't course correct at a younger age.
Right. Exactly.
And I also think thinking about our own death can be a good way to, it kind of ties into this in a way where using that as a motivator to make the most of today and every day and
Exactly.
not have regrets, get to the end of our life. So kind of using that
Exactly.
as our final destination, which it is for all of us, and then using that to kick ourselves in the butt and to really get out there and live a life without regret.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things about this pandemic era that we're in is that all of us are, at some level, either explicitly or implicitly, being forced to confront our mortality. I mean, there's death all around us in a way that there wasn't 2 or 3 years ago. And whether we're thinking about that directly or indirectly, I do think that it has that function in our lives. Is think about, okay, what really matters, and contemplating death is a way to distill what really matters. But it turns out that contemplating our regrets has that same distillation effect. It actually distills what really matters in our life. And the more we realize, again, one of the things about life that makes it so complicated is that we're dealing with a lot of different things. And what we're trying to figure out is what matters and what doesn't. And a lot doesn't matter. And which means that we should be focusing on the core things that do matter, which is what regret teaches us. What's more is that we also have to think about what we can control and what we can't control. Let me give you an example of that. I found this kind of annoying, but I worked my way through it. So in my quantitative survey of the US population, I wanted to know whether people believed in free will or whether they thought things happen for a reason. So I essentially asked both of those questions to people, saying, do you think that human beings, have free will? That is, they have, a great deal of sovereignty over the course of their lives. And I got most people saying, oh yeah, of course. Then I was like, then I also asked the opposite question, which is, do you think that most things happen for a reason? Meaning that you don't have free will, it's just fate. And most people, overwhelming numbers of people, said yes. That is, most people believed both that they had free will and that things happen for a reason. And that annoyed me at first because it seemed contradictory. But as I thought about it, I was like, well, no, maybe that's right. That at some level, when we think about our lives, one of the most important things that we have to try to figure out is what we can control and what we can't. And there's some interesting research in personality psychology showing that we often think of our lives as a narrative, as a story. But what's interesting about this is that in that story of our lives, are we the author of the story, or are we simply the characters in that story? And the answer is yes, we're both. And so sometimes, we can control things, but not fully. We are not hostages of fate, but we are the product of circumstance, but not exclusively. And teasing that out is actually one of the core things about the core things in life. And so we shouldn't be regretting things that we have no control over. But for things where we have some agency, yeah, we want to use that spear of negativity to think about how to do better in the future.
Can you take another example or two going through all the research you did that might be helpful for people that are experiencing a similar regret?
Like what kind of regret?
Well, you mentioned the fidelity example. Let's talk about somebody who
Yeah.
has cheated on a partner, feels like, it's something that keeps coming up in their mind day in, day out, and they don't know how to deal with that overwhelming emotion.
That's a tough one. And I'm leery about giving I'm leery about giving. I'm leery about giving. I'm leery about giving relationship advice on that. So, but let me tell you what the people who I talked to ended up doing. They ended up disclosing. They ended up trying to make amends, although I don't think you can ever fully make amends. And they ended up drawing a lesson from that, which is that this person to whom I was unfaithful is arguably the most important person in my life, and I cannot do that kind of betrayal again. Now, it's not easy to get there, but I think the process is the same. You have a moral breach like infidelity. You reframe it. Believe me, you're not the only one, according to my database. It's part of the human condition, fortunately or unfortunately. Second, disclosing it to someone else, to your partner, or simply writing about it and trying to make sense of it is a way to defang it. And three, and most important, extract a lesson from it. In some cases, not that many, the lesson was, well, wait a second. The existing relationship that I'm in is not right for me and not right for the other person. And this is a signal that the relationship itself is flawed. But in many cases, it was, oh my God, this was a terrible betrayal. And I actually endangered something that is precious to me. And I better fricking not do that again.
Well, let's use finances as an example. Somebody who we'll use that number 65 again and coming up on retirement age and maybe they haven't saved properly for the later years in life, and they don't really have anything they can do at this point, and they're having big regrets on that.
Yeah, that's a harder one because foundation regrets accumulate. So it's like there's a famous line from a Hemingway novel where one character says to another character, "Oh, I went bankrupt." And the other guy says, "How'd you go bankrupt?" And he says, "Gradually, then suddenly." So that's how these foundation regrets emerge. So if you're 65 and you haven't saved enough money, that's a hard problem to solve. I think that what you want to do is two things. One, transmit those lessons to other people you care about who are younger or who are in a position to do that. That you can create a legacy, a positive legacy from your negative regrets. The second thing to do for foundation regrets, and it's hard. I don't want to make it seem easier than it really is that it's that old Chinese adage that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So start now. And again, I don't want to, maybe because every year I creep closer to that age, but I don't want to look at 65 as like this incredibly, the end of one's life, that you're in your final gasps on this planet. Many people who are 65 in North America will be around for another 20 years, 25 years. And so you can still try to make up for that. So for foundation regrets, transmit the knowledge to others and start now.
All right. Well, Dan, you shared a lot on regret and how to turn regret from a negative to a positive. Really like the book and really appreciate you coming on and sharing all your knowledge. So thank you. Other than people getting a copy of the new book, how can they connect with you after the show?
You can go to my website, which is danpink.com, danpink.com, all kinds of resources and a free newsletter on there.
I'm going to link everything up in the show notes. Dan, I thank you for your time.
What a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.